Hello and welcome to another edition of Ask the Expert. Today we'll be talking about the Hardwood Ecosystem Experiment. We're joined today by Project Coordinator Charlotte Owings and Associate Professor of Ecology and Natural Resources Mike Saunders. The Hardwood Ecosystem Experiment, also known as HEE, H-E-E, started about 15 years ago, and it's a project that's a joint effort with FNR and Purdue FNR and several other universities and independent partners. So I'm going to first toss it to Mike, and he's going to tell us a little bit more about HEE, and then Charlotte's going to join in. If you have any questions throughout today's broadcast, join us in the comment section on Facebook, and we will ask those questions throughout the session and maybe even have them answer some after the fact. This will be the first of a few sessions on the HEE. We will be doing them on the last Thursday of every month for the next few months, and you can get to know the experiment even further. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Mike and let him tell you a little bit more about the HEE.
Thank you, Wendy. The Hardwood Ecosystem Experiment, this is a 100-year study, a very long-term study that we've put in with several partners throughout the state. And I'm going to start today talking a little bit about where we put this project and why, and then Charlotte will give you more details of the location in the state, a little bit more about what exactly we're doing down there. A second. The Hardwood Ecosystem Experiment here in Indiana, we lie right in the heart of the Oak-Hickory forest. This is a large belt throughout most of the eastern U.S. It's indicated by the dark green in the figure here that I'm kind of pointing at with my mouse. This area contains 36% of all the forest land in the eastern U.S. It has a 123.6 billion cubic feet of timber, of materials that we can use to make houses, lumber, etc. And it also is, and this has an estimated value of almost $500 billion. So it's a very important resource economically, but it's a lot more than that. It's more than just timber. The forest here in the eastern U.S., this Oak-Hickory forest, sequesters 3.2 billion tons of carbon. So in terms of climate change, it's a really important sink for a lot of carbon. Oaks are thought to be one of the most important food sources for birds and mammals in the eastern U.S. Oak trees provide a lot of great mast. The acorns are eaten by many species of animals and birds that we all care for. Deer, turkey, raccoons. You can see mice. A lot of things use oaks either directly for a food source or indirectly. There's a plethora of insect species, Lepidoptera, and other like butterflies that all use oak foliage at one point of their lifespan, usually in the caterpillar stage.
Mike, forgive me for interrupting. We can't see your screen.
Oh. Thank you. I'm having some issues here. Is that better? The oak's resource supports a higher level of biodiversity than most other forest types in the eastern U.S. The maple beech forest that often will replace oak forest over time without some type of disturbance. They've been shown to have a much lower level of biodiversity than many other of our forest types. And since this oak forest lies kind of where a lot of people recreate, a lot of people live, it's a major source of recreation. Many of us love to go out to the oak forest. We go camping, we enjoy the water resources in this habitat. It's a really integral part of our outdoor lives in the eastern U.S. But there are some problems with the Oak-Hickory forest. when we look at the current age structure of the Oak-Hickory woodlands in the northern forest, or basically this area from Missouri through Maryland up to Maine and over to Minnesota, all those Oak-Hickory forests, what we see is a large bump. We see a lot of acres of forest in this like 50 to 80, maybe 100-year age class. This is all a function of the history of disturbance in the eastern US, of land clearing for agricultural and then subsequent land abandonment on poor farmland. So we have a lot of forest of that age. We have very few really old forest, but conversely, we don't have a lot of very young forest. So we don't have a lot of these baby forests, but we have mostly these middle-aged to mature forest, and then very few older forest. So why is that a problem? Well, if we think of the current way that we're harvesting timber and these lands are turning over in the eastern US, and we project this out 50 years, what we end up finding is that we have even fewer really, really young forests and a lot fewer middle-aged forest and a lot more mature forest. And what this means is we start to lose habitat. We start to lose some of the values that this diverse age structure landscape provides us, as most of these older forests are going through a process of conversion to another type. And this is what we're seeing in the eastern US, is these aging forests change in composition. This is some data from the Hardwood Ecosystem Experiment that we took in 2006, prior to the start of our treatments down there. And if you look at this graphic, the green here is an indication of the oak and hickory in this forest. So 68% of the trees we found in these stands were in the overstory were oaks, whereas 12% here were in this tolerant class, which is like maple and beech. But if we looked underneath the overstory into some of the smaller trees, the saplings, the small mid-story trees, what we saw is the converse. We saw 13% of those smaller trees as oak, and almost 50% of it as maple and beech. So as these trees, if we don't have any disturbance, if we don't do anything to create holes in the canopy and open it up, what we're going to see is a large scale shift in the eastern US from oak hickory dominated forest with all their associated values that we put on it to a maple beech forest, much more tolerant forest that will not carry the amount of biodiversity and will not sequester the carbon in the same way. So this is the issue that we're trying to address at HEE. Because we understand we have this several century record of forest management in Europe and over 100 years here in the North America, that forest management can help reverse these trends. We can use forest management to alter the age structure of forest and the composition of the forest to provide values for wildlife, for water, for recreation, and for timber. But in Indiana here, we're not sure what management would be most successful. Our sites are quite rich compared to several parts of the country. And what is going to be the right management to basically regenerate a plethora of these oak seedlings in this picture and get at least a component? We're not looking necessarily for a pure oak forest, but we want a significant component of oak in the next stands, in the next forest. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Charlotte to describe the Hardwood Ecosystem Experiment.
Thank you, Mike. So Mike gave us a great background as to why we're interested in looking at forest management to continue regenerating oak and hickory forests and why they're so important to us. So the Hardwood Ecosystem Experiment is designed to look at what forest management techniques are best at regenerating oak and hickory in Indiana, and what the impacts of those are on our plants and wildlife. So the Hardwood Ecosystem Experiment began in 2006, hopefully to be a 100-year-long project, a long-term study. We're in our 15th year of data collection this year, so we've only got 85 more to go, but it's a really exciting start. And we're a partnership of many groups. So the Hardwood Ecosystem Experiment involves researchers from Drake University, a number from Purdue University, Ball State University, Indiana State University, partners in the Indiana Department of Natural Resources, and a number of institutions as researchers come and go with different studies. When the HEE was developed, there were 4 main goals. The first of which was to develop even-aged and uneven-aged silvicultural systems that maintain oak-dominated forest communities and landscapes. And basically what we mean here is we're looking at what forest management techniques can we use to maintain our oak and hickory-dominated forests. And then our second goal was to determine both the positive and negative impacts of these systems on populations of herbaceous plants, birds, and amphibians. So when we do different forest management techniques, what are both the positive, neutral, or negative impacts that these have on the different wildlife and vegetation we find in our forests? And the third goal was to determine the social and economic ramifications of these systems in our local and regional communities. And then our fourth and final goal was to provide demonstration sites and develop novel educational materials and techniques to engage the public concerning forest management. So each year we do a number of field tours with different groups, getting them out into our research sites so they can see what the different types of forest management techniques look like firsthand, hear from our researchers and staff about the different studies that we're doing and different findings. We've also had a number of Purdue Extension publications come out to share about the projects and the findings that we're having from our different studies, as well as a number of videos. So education is one of the core components of the Hardwood Ecosystem Experiment. So the Hardwood Ecosystem Experiment, or HEE, is located in Morgan Monroe and Yellowwood State Forest in Indiana, so near Martinsville and Bloomington, respectively. We have 9 study sites, or what we call our research cores, that are about 200 acres in size, spread amongst Morgan Monroe and Yellowwood State Forests. Each of those 9 is assigned to 3 different management treatments. The first of which is we have 3 core areas designated as our controls, or our areas in which we aren't doing any harvesting. So every scientific study needs to have controls, and our study has 3 200-acre areas set aside for that. Our second management treatment that we're looking at has 3 different cores assigned to uneven age management, excuse me. So we've got single tree harvesting in those, or we call it single tree selection, where we've removed, single trees across those 200-acre areas, as well as patch cuts, which are 1, 3, and 5-acre areas in which we've removed the trees. Then in our even-aged units, our 3 remaining units and cores, we have clear cuts, which are 10-acre areas in which all the trees have been removed. Shelter woods, which are 10 acres in size, in which all the trees are being removed, but you can think about it on a longer scale, that they're being removed more gradually. And then in 2015, one of the new aspects we added, one of the new components we're looking at with the Hardwood Ecosystem Experiment, is the use of prescribed fire as a management tool. So we're also looking at the use of fire to regenerate oak and hickory, as well as the effects of fire on different plant and animal species. So throughout our 15-year history of the HEE, we've had a lot of past and current research that's taken place. We've had studies looking at box turtles, trees and herbaceous plants, beetles, breeding birds, salamanders, ruffed grouse, small mammals, owls, etc., and the list keeps growing every year. But it's hard to talk about the Hardwood Ecosystem Experiment without also giving a shout out to all the people who have been involved. We've had about 20 principal investigators or PIs involved with the project in its 15-year history so far, 8 different universities and agencies, over 250 undergraduate and postgraduate field technicians that have come and worked on studies at the HEE, sometimes spring, sometimes summer, sometimes fall, sometimes all 3 of those seasons. We've had over 35 graduate students come and do their graduate research on the HEE study sites. And all of the work done by and data collected done by those groups and those individuals has helped us have over 65 publications in peer-reviewed scientific journals from data collected at the HEE. And while they do a lot of work, we do like to point out that, you know, it is a lot of fun. Our over 250 field technicians do learn a lot while they're out in the field, do really great research, get great field experience, and also get to enjoy each other's company. And that was a very short kind of overview of the HEE, but I think we're going to turn it over to Wendy for questions.
Great. Thanks, Mike and Charlotte. That was a great intro. Again, if any of you watching have questions specifically for Charlotte and Mike about the project or how it affects you or anything to do with the Hardwood Ecosystem Experiment, they are open to your questions. First, though, let me start with you, Mike. I know there's a lot about oak and hickories we're talking about. Why are they so important to us, and why should I care if they're going away, if they're getting old?
That's a good question. I'll start with, I covered a little bit of this. The oak wildlife, the value of oak trees and the mast and the habitat they provide to wildlife is pretty paramount. No other species in the eastern U.S. or group of species in the eastern U.S. provides quite the amount of habitat and different types of, is quite as important to wildlife as oak. I mean, there's well over 200 species. Some people put it at 300 species of vertebrates that use oak in some part of their life cycle for food or for habitat. We have endangered species such as the Indiana bat, that it's pretty critical to have some of an oak component in the forest for maternity roost. So there's a lot of threatened and endangered species that rely on oak and hickory. We also see that oak and hickory, they're pretty paramount on maintaining ecosystem services throughout the eastern U.S. They provide a forest type, a forest condition where if you've ever been in an oak hickory forest, they provide a really diffuse light. In fact, I'm sitting under an oak tree right now. It's like a diffuse light on the ground. So you get a lot of grasses and you get a lot of vegetation, herbs and rare plants that can form under these communities. So there's just a great deal of biodiversity, a lot more than we see under some of on the species that are going to replace them, potentially replace oaks, maple and beech. These species cast very heavy shade. So a lot of times when you're under maple and beech trees, there's almost no ground vegetation. It's just too shaded. And without ground vegetation, all the suites of insects and everything, all the parts of the food web that depend on that ground vegetation are gone. So when you make that comparison in terms of biodiversity's sake, it's pretty important to keep oaks around. Economically, it's essential. We have a large industry in the eastern U.S., a lot of oak furniture. Everybody probably in their house has oak trim, oak doors. This is all really important in terms of housing, and it's actually important in terms of food stock. If you like wine, if you like bourbon, all of that is being aged in oak barrels. So I've been actually working a lot trying to on white oak in particular, because white oak is what we use in these barrels, and that's what gives the flavor to the wine and gives the flavor to the bourbon. And without oak trees, you can't make bourbon.
So basically, Mike, it's a trickle-down effect. We have to take care of the trees so then they can take care of the animals, and then they can give us the wood that we need to get the fun things that we like to enjoy in life.
Right. There's multiple values to the oak forest. I'm not saying we need oak forest absolutely everywhere, but we need to be able to replace the oak forest we have. And that's currently not happening. We're losing oak forest every year.
So Charlotte, tell me a little bit about how are these findings that are happening on the HEE going to benefit me as a private citizen? Can I use the things that you guys are doing on my land? Is that something that's going to help me in my backyard if I have, you know, tree stands I'm trying to take care of? Like, I guess, explain to us what the impact of this on the general public can be.
Certainly. Thanks, Wendy. So, generally, at least with our study, our hope is that our findings can help inform forest management. So we know how different forest management techniques affect various wildlife. And really, it's going to come down to kind of what each individual private woodland owner, what their goals are for their property. So sometimes that's using findings from the HEE if you want to really have a property that's great for bats or great for different breeding birds. That's going to probably involve different forest management techniques. I would like to plug specifically one program we have or a part of is the Woodland Wildlife Steward. We had our first workshop last year for private woodland owners, and he was part of it, helping share our science with different private woodland owners, as well as it was led by Purdue Extension to really help landowners, depending on what their goals were, decided what management techniques they could use to get there.
Great. Mike, can you fill us in? What are some of the things that have been found so far? I know we're 15 years into the project, and you had that great list of all the animals and wildlife and things that have been found on the HEE property. What are some of the most interesting things that you guys have found in the 15 years so far?
So a few years back, we actually had a PhD student, Dr. Barney Dunning here at Purdue, and work on a breeding bird project looking at how fledglings are basically those young birds that have just, they're not quite ready to fly a long way, but they've been kind of out of the nest. They're learning to fly, kind of the teenagers of the bird world. And we had him basically do some mist netting and some other work in our clear cut areas or in our patch cuts, looking at how those birds might be using that habitat. And one of the biggest things we found was there was a lot of fledglings from mature bird species, mature forest bird species we didn't know really used these habitats. The mature birds, the adults don't really use these habitats, but this was critical habitat for the teenagers, for the fledglings, because it was someplace where they could hide from predators because they couldn't get away easily because they didn't know how to fly very well, and there was a ton of food. So we're starting to really rethink how important it is to have this juxtaposition of young forest with older forest really in close proximity to one another, so that all components of habitat that is available for birds are very close to one another. If you have a landscape that has nothing but mature forest, then you don't have really the greatest habitat for some of the younger of some of those species. So, I mean, we've seen similar trends with different taxa groups, that we see differences in diversity, functional diversity, biodiversity, not in necessarily one type of management, but in the fact that we have this plethora of different types of management. So if I had to sum it all up in kind of one sentence, it's like what we've learned is landscape diversity is good. So use all types of management to create a diversity of forest conditions of different ages, of different compositions across the landscape.
Charlotte, any of your favorite findings so far? I know that the bird one sounds amazing. I can't believe that we didn't know they were there, and all of a sudden we were making such a large discovery, and it's so early on in the experiment. But anything that sticks out to you?
Yes, I mean, definitely Patrick Ruhl's research was really interesting about the mature forest species utilizing the clear cuts. But one of my, at least the ones that just really stood out to me is we have a group of researchers from Ball State University looking at the endangered cerulean warbler. And those bird species, the cerulean warbler is really utilizing mature oak trees a lot for where it nests, like quite a bit. And they are at those little nests are way at the tippy top of those huge oak trees. And so for me, at least, seeing all the pictures of our techs, they're always having to lean all the way back on the road, like that picture we had of it taking a lot of work, but also being a lot of fun, because they have to get that far back to see the little nests and monitor them in those big oak trees. But oaks are extremely important to that bird species. And for me, that's just one of the many examples of how important oak is to some of the species in our forests.
So question, how do we do these different studies? I mean, obviously there's a lot of people involved. There's a lot of, I'm sure, equipment involved. Are we using drones to monitor some of those things at the top? I mean, I guess, can you tell us how we're doing what we're doing?
I'll let Charlotte take that one.
All right. I have to give a huge shout out to our former field coordinator, Jeff Riegel, and our current field coordinator, Danielle Williams, for all the work they've done with coordinating. We have a bunch of different projects going on at the same time with many different protocols, many different instruments they're using. We have beetle traps that are out there in the summer that are different colors, different shapes to attract different types of beetles that are checked. We have people going out and misnaming birds when Patrick was doing his work, but also going out and listening to see what birds they can hear just from listening to all the different parts of the HEE to see what birds they can detect. We have people putting geolocators on cerulean warblers to track where they're going and where their migration paths are. We have people out there with measuring tapes and DVH tapes to measure vegetation and density. We just have a ton of techniques going on, a bunch of protocols because of all the different projects we have.
Yeah, I add some other components. We've done work in the past with rattlesnakes that you had to actually basically trap them in a clear vinyl tube and take them into, we actually took them to Indiana University and did surgery on them to implant a radio tracker so we could track where they were moving through the experiment. Box turtles, we would paste transmitters on them and track these box turtles over time and see how far they moved. And we were shocked. We had some turtles move over a mile. I do some work with prescribed fire down there, and I build thermocouples and have to put them inside PVC pipes. It kind of looks a little bit, so if you don't know what it looks kind of scary because it looks almost like a pipe bomb. And I put that in the ground so they can record the temperatures, and I have paints that melt at different temperatures on the site. So there's just a plethora of stuff we're doing there. We're just starting to work on incorporating drones and stuff into our measurements. And I'm hopeful that over the next few months, we can have some of the scientists on that are doing these various studies to describe how we're doing the measurements a little more detail for each one of these components of the HEE.
Great. First, I want to give a shout out. This may be the farthest away we've had anyone watch us, but we just got a shout out from the Department of Forestry at Purdue University in Pakistan. So yay for us. Sorry, I have to get a little hyped about that. But we do have a question from the audience. Changing gears, you were talking a little bit about fire, and you do work a lot with prescribed fire. Amber asks, she would love to burn some of her hardwood acreage. She has 12 acres, but she knows it's super expensive to hire out. what is your advice to make this happen on a budget? And is that something maybe we've learned the best way to do that through the HEE or no?
We really haven't tackled the economics of prescribed fire directly. I have the state division of forestry help me with most of my burns down there. The liability concerns with conducting prescribed fire is usually a limitation to a lot of individuals. I would ask that person to probably reach out to one of their county extension offices. They could probably provide some resources. Maybe if she's already looked into it, maybe this won't help her, but you know, there's some consulting foresters that do prescribe fires. But again, there's going to be some liability concerns. Part of the cost associated with doing prescribed fire in the state is the fact that not a lot of people do it. And we're trying to build those resources. Actually, as an educator, I'm trying to build those resources at Purdue by training students on how to do prescribed fire. Jared Brooks work a lot with students to try to get them experience burning fire, so more and more individuals in the state can do prescribed fire and do these small scale burns. And I'm sure Lenny Farley would be another individual to contact at Purdue that could help, maybe because there might be some cost share programs for doing some prescribed fires. But I am not familiar with those. We can definitely find out and post something in the post on the when we post this online.
Sure. And Amber, I'm posting the links to the Indiana Foresters and also the county extension offices in our comment section. So feel free to reach out to those people. Mike, just wanted to get your thoughts though. Thanks for that about why prescribed fire does have a cost associated with it. Cause I know a lot of people we don't want people just going out and burning willy-nilly, et cetera. Yeah. So great advice there. Maybe tied to that, Mike, why do we need to manage our forests as independent woodland owners? You know, and what does that exactly mean? Maybe I have inherited land, or I have, you know, property that I've just had forever and I don't really know what to do with it. Why do I need to take care of that? And what impact does that have? I mean, I know obviously you're looking on a larger scale.
Yeah. Well, management, you know, we use management to achieve the goals of an individual. If the individual's major goal is just to go out to the woods and walk every once in a while, maybe there's a minimal amount of management we do. We should still try to be stewards of that. As last week's guest talked about, you know, if we don't manage, a lot of times we get this buildup of invasive species in the understories of these forests, and then we lose the enjoyment of those forests because we can't literally walk through them. By managing the forests, we hopefully modify the composition and the age structure to achieve benefit from the forest, whether that means more wildlife. So we could do management in the forest to increase the amount of deer, provide habitat for deer, for wildlife. So management is being used to basically achieve your goals. We see a lot, when we look in the broader eastern United States, most private lands are not being managed at all. They're just kind of people are just walking away. And when you're losing value, we're losing maybe not economic value, but you're losing wildlife value, you're losing biodiversity value, you're losing resources. Management provides a backdrop to kind of push a structure in a direction where you can get greater good from the forest. Management does not necessarily mean harvesting trees. It can mean a multitude of other things. It can, if you want to get more income, or we have to rapidly shift the forest into a different condition, but there's ways to manage without doing extensive harvest of overstory timber.
Great advice. Charlotte, tell us, how do I keep up with the HEE and what's going on? I know you guys have some social media channels and some YouTube videos, various things like that. How can I follow if I'm interested in seeing whatever you guys are seeing on site?
Sure. We are really new to Twitter. So we just got a Hardwood Ecosystem Experiment Twitter account. We've been posting on there a couple times a week with interesting things we see in the field, new publications that come out. And we've been doing, since we can't do in-person field tours right now because of COVID-19 restrictions, we're trying to do a few videos that are almost like being on a field tour with us and trying to release those about every week or every other week. So I would definitely suggest following us on Twitter to stay really up to date. I also suggest checking out our website, heforeststudy.org. On there is some more background about the projects, a bunch of the publications, especially the extension ones, as well as videos. You can also see all the researchers involved in the various research projects, and we try to keep that pretty updated. And on there, you can also find my email if you want to be subscribed to the HEE newsletter. We send it out about twice a year, usually February, March, and then August, September, with updates on new graduate students who joined, different projects we have going on, new publications that came out. So feel free to send me an email and I'd be happy to add anybody to that listserv.
Mike, can you talk about some of the techniques that we're using? We talked a little bit about prescribed fire, and I know each one of the sites has different methods that we're trying out, but what are some of those things that people may or may not have heard of in terms of forest management we're using on the HEE?
So we're doing, there's quite a few things we're trying. We're doing single tree selection, which is the typical way that many forests are managed but on private lands in the state, where you essentially are thinning out the overstory gradually over time of trees. Typically taking some of the more valuable ones, but taking out some of the poor quality ones as well as you go. And you come in once every 10 to 15 years when you're doing that. We're also trying a little bit more aggressive as we do shelter woods, where basically with shelter woods, it's kind of a planned thing. We're going to remove the overstory basically over the forest. We're going to regenerate the entire forest over a matter of about 20 years through three stages of removal of all the trees. So that creates a really young forest condition over time, but it's not quite as aggressive as going in and cutting down all the trees at once. So it provides a much more gradual transition, and you can do you can modify a shelter wood in a lot of ways to actually to keep trees around and keep mature trees on site for a very long time. And then we're doing patch cuts and clear cuts where we're removing all of the overstory. They only differ basically by the size of the area that we're treating, to rapidly create a young forest condition where we have regenerating trees and getting the stand going. And then we're going to do thinnings periodically as we get where we're going to kind of like favor some trees over the other as the trees grow and get older. So that's some of the treatments we're doing. They cover the general range of forestry treatments we do in the state. I will say our clear cuts are some of the, not a lot of clear cutting is done in Indiana. I would say 90% of our stands are managed with single tree selection. So what we're learning from doing these clear cuts and these patch cuts really hasn't been looked at seriously in the state, particularly on the higher site qualities that we're looking at. There's been a little work done on the Hoosier way down in southern Indiana on really poor sites, but not up here.
So I guess, Charlotte, that brings up a really good question. So Mike talked about we're doing a lot of things that maybe aren't done in our state, but yet a lot of other things that are kind of in line with what other people are doing. Are other states doing similar studies? Are there HEE experiments going on in other states that we're working with, et cetera?
So we actually, when the HEE was started, our researchers and the people who started the project met with researchers from the Missouri Ozark Forest Ecosystem Project, or MOFEP. We modeled the HEE off of their study. They're looking at somewhat different compositions, and they've got kind of a different, I don't want to say environment, but their conditions are different down there. In terms of oak and some of the other components. But we are actually modeled off that project, which is also looking at a number of different species that are involved in their ecosystem as part of their project. And so we are modeled off of them, and they are about 30 years in. So that's a similar study that's going on that we're also learning from and collaborating with now and then.
Sorry, all. It started pouring on me. I had my room set up outside, my office set up outside, so you could have a good background, and it poured on me.
You can't control nature. So we talked a little bit about the Missouri experiment and what they're doing there. How are we interconnected with these other universities? I know there's so many universities there. There's so many professors involved. Is there a lot of joint research that's happening? Is it, certain projects served by certain universities? How does that all work on the HEE?
We've done some collaborative research with MOFEB. A couple of our professors have reached out and done and have published some papers at looking at comparing our results with theirs. I've been in touch with a lot of them on doing joint research, and we do try to kind of copy each other's experiments a little bit in some respects, to learn how how the responses might differ across the forest. There's several other, I think many of the individuals in the project, our bat researcher, Dr. Joy O'Keefe, she actually does a lot of work on the HEE and actually in the Missouri Ozarks associated with MOFEB to compare the responses of bats across the different systems. So we don't have a ton of formal joint projects with other groups, but a lot of our PIs, our investigators, our scientists are working in multiple ecosystems and then relating HEE results to those ecosystems as well.
I want to jump in here just with one of my favorite things about the project too, is because we're 15 years in, we're getting to a really exciting point where our researchers can collaborate together really well. We're using our overstory data to help inform the bat study, to look at their use of snags. We had a postdoc a couple years ago start looking at the functional diversity by incorporating data from a lot of the studies for the Hardwood Ecosystem Experiment. So we're kind of getting to the point where we're 15 years along and we can start having different studies inform the others, which is really exciting.
Mike, I'm going to ask you to predict the future here. Where do you see the HEE going? I know it's a 100-year project and there's so many different things that could happen from it, but and Charlotte talked about some of the goals of the project, but where do you see things going? Like, is this, going to change the way that we do things in our forests across the country?
Well, we're already seeing based on some of the early results we've seen with prescribed fire in our study. We're seeing a lot more emphasis of the Indiana Department of Forestry, or Division of Forestry, to wanting to incorporate fire within management regimes, within their management in the state forest in the southern part of Indiana. I think there's going to be a lot of, as we go forward, we're going to learn more. We're learning a lot about bats. So, for example, some of the research that we did on HEE really informed some of the Indiana bat guidelines and just general bat management across most of Indiana. I think as we move forward, and if I look through the future, and we get this longer and longer string of data to draw from, we'll be able to link to other studies across the eastern U.S. and hardwood stands, and really kind of inform some general patterns of like carbon allocation, general biodiversity, larger scale studies that should really advance science, our understanding of forest science in this part of the country. You know, we're 15 years out, and we're now having to start thinking about entering these stands again. I mean, this is only in forestry long-term. When we think long-term in forestry, you know, we're thinking decades. And it's just around the corner in 2028 when we're going in to do another round of harvesting and another and more prescribed fire. So it's a very dynamic project, and we're going to be in the future pretty interested in adding components and adding scientists to it to look at different parts of this ecosystem that we call the Indiana forest.
Charlotte, anything you want to add about where you see the future of the project and or things you've seen?
I mean, just to echo Mike, I mean, it's a pretty adaptive project. You know, we have new project ideas and people interested in doing studies coming in all the time. We just had a graduate student from Miami University who just started some work on, you know, earthworms. We've started looking at fungal diversity with different researchers. So I'm just excited for what projects are getting added to the ones that we measure every year. I think also right now we're just dipping our toes into Twitter and social media. So I'm excited about having new outlets to share our research and keep everybody updated.
Great. Well, this has been super informative, and I hope everyone learned a lot about the Hardwood Ecosystem Experiment, and we've just scratched the surface today for sure. And so join us the last Thursday of every month. We're going to have someone from the HEE with us. Next month, we're going to have Allison Hoax, who does salamander research, and also Danielle Williams, who's one of the bird researchers on the HEE, and they're going to be with us then. But in the meantime, mark your calendar. We're off next week, so enjoy your 4th of July holiday. Mark your calendar for July 9th. It is National Pollinators Week this week, so we owe it to you to tell you on July 9th, we're going to be talking about pollinators, not just bees, but all of them that make such an impact on our ecosystem. And I'm sure Mike and Charlotte would echo that in our forests as well. So mark your calendar July 9th for our next FNR Ask the Expert, and then also for the last Thursday of the month, each month, if you want to tune in and learn more about the HEE. So with that said, thank you, Charlotte. Thank you, Mike. And I hope if any of you at home have any further questions, put those in the comments, and they will be happy to answer those after the fact. So thanks again, and see you in a couple of weeks.
Thank you.